October 1st marks the day when former Chinese Communist Party head Mao Zedong declared communist control in China. Joining us to discuss the Chinese Communist Party's decades of oppression is Trevor Loudon, an author, filmmaker, and public speaker. For more than 30 years, he has researched Marxist movements as well as the influence of the CCP. Good afternoon to you, Trevor. First, I'd like to have your thoughts, your reactions to the raising of the CCP flag over Philadelphia City Hall.
Well, Philadelphia is the city council there is very much controlled by the left wing, the same as it is in Massachusetts. And they were doing similar things in Massachusetts for several years with a lot of protest. I think it's quite disgusting, actually. Would you raise the Nazi flag over your city hall? You know, one of the most repressive regimes on the planet, and you proudly fly their flag over your civic building. That just shows how left-wing and radical the Philadelphia City Council actually is. And the people of Philadelphia need to do something about that at the next election.
Yeah, it is strange. So 76 years ago today, CCP head Mao Zedong declared communist control. Can you explain how the CCP gained power and the role that violence played in establishing its control?
Well, so the CCP was set up by the Soviet Union or established with Soviet help in the early 1920s and gradually were forced out of the cities. They were strong in Shanghai for a while, but they were forced out into the countryside. And it was they established themselves in northwest China, and they established a safe haven there because the Kuomintang government of Chiang Kai-shek was busy fighting the Japanese for most of that time. And the main threat was Japan. And so the communists were safe in northwest China. They gradually built up their strength and they went on a long march into the south, basically using the Japanese to defeat Chiang Kai-shek's forces and then coming in at the end and taking over China when Chiang Kai-shek was basically betrayed by communists in the U.S. State Department, who refused to continue arming his military. So the Soviets backed the Chinese Communist Party and supplied them with arms, supplied them with weapons. They weren't defeated because the nationalist forces were fighting the Japanese. And at the same time, you had communist Soviet agents in the US State Department propagandizing for the Communist Party and defunding and basically betraying Chiang Kai-shek's forces. So without the Soviet Union and without the communists in the US State Department, the communist forces never would have come to power. Their whole existence was one of a reign of terror. Whenever they took over a region, they would persecute and execute local landowners or local business people and terrorize the region. And they have never stopped. They're still terrorizing people in China today. It is nothing to be proud of that China has lived under 76 years of the tyranny of the Chinese Communist Party. That should be embarrassing to China and to us in the West who have never done anything about this.
So can you elaborate on that point? How have the Chinese people suffered under CCP rule since the beginning to today? And can you also mention about CCP campaigns like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution?
Well, the Great Leap Forward was that was an attempt. Mao took over a peasant nation. And even classical Marxism tells you if you have a peasant feudal society, you need to bring in capitalism to create the wealth, and then you go into a socialized collective society. That's classic Marxism. Mao tried to go directly from a peasant feudal society into an industrial society. That proved to be a massive disaster, leading to widespread famine, an estimated 50 million deaths, which is, the population of Great Britain. There was a bit like the Americans losing 30 million people today. Just 30 million people would die because of government policy. And then they, to consolidate power in the early 60s, Mao instituted what he called the Cultural Revolution, that to get rid of the four olds, to get rid of the old tradition, the old books, the old religious ideas, etc. So he empowered young radical youth, the Red Guards, who were just teenage kids, filled them up with propaganda to hate their parents, hate their elders, hate their teachers, and sent them on a rampage through the institutions, burning books, ripping down statues, destroying remnants of the old society, terrorizing people, turning in their parents to the authorities, killing their teachers. There were even instances of cannibalism. The young kids were whipped up into such a frenzy of hatred by Mao's forces that there were even reports of eating their victims, eating people they didn't like. So that was to completely eliminate the old society so that a new socialist society could be built on the ashes of the old. And that was in the 1960s. So that was all about consolidating communist power, getting rid of any vestiges of the old order, Chinese tradition, Chinese religion, cultural heritage, because a new society had to be built. You know, Pol Pot did a similar thing in Cambodia. He wanted to out Mao, and he killed a third of his population in an attempt to eliminate the old society. You wear glasses. Even people in Cambodia who wore glasses were executed because they were considered to be considered intellectuals, and they didn't want intellectuals because intellectuals might question the new regime. So that was Maoism. That was the extreme version of Maoism in Cambodia. But Mao's China was just about as brutal and just about as vicious. It is nothing to be proud of in human history that the CCP was allowed to come to power.
Wow, that is wild. I mean, I can't even wrap my head around that. Can't even wear glasses. And cannibalism.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, this is documented stuff, you know, because the young people, these were young kids, and they were indoctrinated all day long in their schools to hate their parents, to hate the old culture, to hate the capitalists, and to bring the new, you know, and kids are impressionable. They had the government fully indoctrinating them and setting them loose as a rampaging army to basically terrorize and kill those who might have been anti-communist or anti the regime or not sufficiently enthusiastic for the new way. So yeah, it's about as real Lord of the Flies stuff. This was turning the little bit of evil that's in everybody, magnifying it and letting it loose on society, a deliberate government policy. It'd be like, you know, Antifa on steroids, you know, like every American high school kid was encouraged to join Antifa and go on a rampage against their school and against their parents and against their professors. That's what it was like, a nationwide militarized Antifa with the full backing of the government. Setting, just going after anybody the government didn't like.
And as you know, Trevor, actually, Western nations back in the early 2000s were hoping that China would become more democratic, actually, after the country was allowed into the World Trade Organization, right? Can you speak to that? How has freedoms in China changed over the years?
Look, this was the big scam that Kissinger sold Nixon, that if we trade with China, they will become more like us and more democratic, and we can wean them away from the Soviet Union. And when Deng Xiaoping introduced so-called free market reforms, a lot of people in the West thought, that proves the point. They've abandoned communism. They're going back to capitalism. But look, any Marxist will tell you, if you read Marxist or Maoist literature, man goes through 5 stages of development, according to a Marxist. Primitive communism, the caveman stage, feudalism, where you have agriculture and warlords, and then you have the birth of capitalism, where there is business and banking and a legal system is established and a flowering of wealth. Then you go to socialism, then you go to communism. Well, Mao, after the disaster of the Great Leap Forward, the Chinese communists acknowledged their mistake. They tried to go from feudalism to socialism without going through capitalism, and it was an absolute disaster. So under Deng Xiaoping, they corrected their non-Marxist era and went back to a state-controlled form of capitalism to build up the wealth. And the West thought this was proof that they'd abandoned communism. No, it was proof that they were good Marxists, that they understood history and were actually going back to the capitalist stage to build the wealth so then they could go into socialism with a strong economy and, most importantly, a very strong military. So we encouraged that, we funded that, and now China is firmly back on the socialist road, heading towards communism. But the problem is they want to take us with them. So look, it was a huge misunderstanding of Marxism to think that China was ever going to go off the communist road unless its own people overthrew the Communist Party or some outside force intervened. The Communist Party is very strong. They're committed to socialism. They're committed to communism. And they're absolutely committed to expanding their power across the Pacific and into Southeast Asia and Australasia. That's their communist role. That's their destiny. And they're firmly on that road today.
And just one final question, Trevor. Can you also talk to us about what was China like before the CCP, and how has the CCP's policies suppressed traditional culture in China?
Well, China was quite a primitive society in some ways because it was economically strangulated by the feudal system. The warlords controlled things. But culturally and spiritually, it had a heritage going back several thousand years, one of the richest cultures on the planet. So we tended to, because China was not developed, we tended to think it wasn't a strong culturally, but it was absolutely strong. The people had a very strong and proud culture. So the communists came in and they knew they had to overthrow the feudal system and build up the economy. They knew they had to do that. But they also knew they had to completely destroy China's cultural roots because they think religion and faith and spiritual values are a bourgeois capitalists. They're the opium of the people. And so therefore you have to completely eliminate those. So they took a moral people, a hardworking, entrepreneurial, moral people, which had deep spiritual values, and tried to drive every single bit of that out of them. And then they turned them into capitalists, like greedy, like petty bourgeois capitalists. And what I would say, in the Communist Party today, to get ahead, you have to be immoral. You have to betray your friends. You have to be self-centered. You have to disavow your culture and your family. They turned the noble Chinese people into some of the shallowest people now on the planet. They destroyed the moral virtue of the Chinese people. It's not extinguished. It's still there. But the richest and most powerful people in China today are the worst people in China. The best people in China today tend to be more of the middle class, the lower peasantry, that sort of thing, who have clung to some vestige of their traditional culture. When you're dealing with the CCP, you're dealing with completely morally bankrupt, morally inferior people. It's like dealing with the mafia. That's what it's like dealing with.
Okay, well, Trevor, we're out of time today, but we all here really enjoy hearing your insight. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. Always great to be on. Thank you.